Hey, this is Danny from Scare Talk. Before we get into all the horror greatness, I gotta let you know about Anchor. Anchor is the host site that we use to record our podcast. Anchor will upload your podcast to Apple and Spotify and many other listening platforms. Anchor is completely free, and you can download the app or go to the website, anchor.fm, and you can record straight on there. There's also some cool editing tools that you can use. Did I mention that it's free? Yeah, so if you want to make a podcast, Anchor is the way to go. Go check it out. Now, for the spooky stuff.
Welcome to Scare Talk, a horror movie podcast for horror fans. This podcast will cover horror movie reviews, ratings, and rankings. Now for your hosts, Danny and Joel.
All right, this is Danny. This is Scare Talk. I am Danny, and I am here with Jason Giambi. Joel.
Hey guys, what's up?
And a special guest, author of horror books and baseball, Bruce Marcusen.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So we have Bruce here. He is most recently written a horror book. He also writes other baseball books and works at the Baseball Hall of Fame. So we want to talk with him about some of that stuff. So Bruce, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. I've been working at the Hall of Fame now since 1995. Off and on, I've actually had 2 stints at the Hall of Fame. Baseball, in a lot of ways, was my first love. I grew up as a baseball fan in the early 70s. My father loved baseball, and that was a big influence in why I liked the game, too. But at the same time, as I became a huge fan of baseball, I also was developing an interest in horror. I read some horror-related books, some short ghost stories. Then from there, I really became interested in chiller theater, which aired on Friday and Saturday nights in the New York City market, WPIX Channel 11.
All right.
So kind of weird that these have been my 2 hobbies, if you will, my 2 main interests, 2 areas that really have little to do with each other. Rarely do they cross over, occasionally, but rarely. And that's how it's worked out for me. I'm almost, I guess, equally a baseball fan and a horror fan.
Cool.
Nice.
That's awesome. So how is it working at the Hall of Fame? Like, what kind of stuff do you do?
Well, I work in the education department, so I work mostly with kids. We actually teach a variety of programs through video conferencing, through virtual field trips. And I've been doing that since 2013. So we've been working with Zoom long before it became fashionable.
Oh, cool.
Nice. We heard of Zoom, many, many years ago. We've used Zoom as our platform. It's called Field Trip Zoom. Now since 2014. So we basically try to teach things that are taught in a typical educational curriculum, but we use baseball. So, for example, we talk about civil rights, but we do it through the story of Jackie Robinson.
Oh, gotcha.
We talk about math, and the way that we do that, we help kids calculate batting average. We talk about the formula, the basic math skills that are used in determining what a batting average is. So we don't just teach baseball for the sake of baseball. We kind of use baseball as the vehicle to teach other things.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, baseball definitely has a long history, and then there's a lot of math involved in baseball and percentages and all kinds of stuff. So that's really cool.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, some physics involved. I don't know if you guys use that, like, pitching and hitting and all that.
We do. Yeah. We do science on the Sandlot, which for me is one of the more difficult ones to teach because I was never very good at science in school. We do have other teachers, though, at the Hall of Fame that can help me out with that, which is nice. But we offer 16 different programs. Wow. So it's a wide range of stuff. And it's basically, trying to use baseball to make some of this stuff more palatable to kids.
Mm-hmm.
If they happen to be baseball fans, they might be more receptive to learn about math and science, geography, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Make it a little more fun and interesting.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So cool. So let's hear about your horror book that you have written. What's that about?
Well, that's my most recent book, and it just came out over the summer. It's called Hosted Horror on Television. It comes out through McFarland Publishing. McFarland does, by coincidence, a lot of baseball books, and they also do a lot of books about movies, especially horror movies. So they're kind of the perfect publisher for me in a lot of ways. But it's a book that it explores the whole phenomenon of movies being shown on television stations, syndicated television stations, starting in the late 1950s with the release of the shock theater package. And that's what made films, classic films like Frankenstein, Dracula, The Wolfman, available to a newer generation of fans, because those movies had never been shown on television prior to their release on shock theater in 1957. So what I did was I looked at all the films, well, not all the films, but most of the films that were featured as part of shock theater and some of these other film packages like creature features. Some were actually called like Son of Shock. Shock Theater was the original one. So what we did was we kind of looked at a lot of these classic films, and we looked at them from the films from the 1930s, the Universal classics, all the way to films from the early 1970s. And again, these were films being shown on television late at night featuring a horror host. Today you have probably the two most popular, Joe Bob Briggs on Shudder, Svengoolie on MeTV. We explore those hosts, but we also look at some of the early hosts. We look at the first horror host ever, which was Vampira. Then when Shock Theater came out, Zachary was the first horror host for that package, first in Philadelphia, then in New York. We looked at, people like Bob Wilkins and all sorts of horror hosts from all over the country, and how they really made the presentation of horror films unique. It wasn't just about the movie itself, but it was also about the skits that the horror host would feature at the beginning of the movie, during commercial breaks. And a lot of times they poked fun at the films. Some of the films weren't that great. I mean, the classics were great, sure, like Frankenstein and the Wolfman, but a lot of the films weren't that great. So it was a perfect opportunity for these horror hosts, who are usually in some sort of a wacky costume, to come on the screen during the program and, deliver kind of a humorous perspective. It really made horror movies an event. And this was a late night event. It was late Friday nights, late Saturday nights. And back when I was 12, 13, 14 years old, I mean, that's always the thing you wanted to do as a kid. You wanted to stay up as late as possible. You always begged your parents, let me stay up till midnight.
Yeah.
And in the case of these movies on Friday and Saturday nights, because there was no school the next day, I sometimes was able to stay up till 1 or 2 in the morning, which was almost unheard of for kids at the time.
Yeah, such a bad kid.
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
Cool. So what time would these air?
Well, the movies sometimes aired 10 o'clock local time. Sometimes, though, they started 11 o'clock or 11:30. And again, going back to this baseball horror connection, which does come up occasionally, the program I watched was Chiller Theater. This was the early 1970s. This is the one where the six-fingered hand would come out of the swamp at the beginning of the program. And a lot of times, Chiller Theater came on after the Yankee game was over. If the Yankees played a Saturday night game, and back then they were starting games around 8 o'clock local time. So the game might go till 11 o'clock, sometimes later if it was extra innings or if there was a rain delay. So you didn't always know when Chiller Theater was going to start. But on nights when the Yankees did play, there was a possibility it would start later. And in those cases, it was harder to stay up to see the entire movie. A lot of times I fell asleep, during the first 15 or 20 minutes just because, I was young and I wasn't used to staying up all that late. But yeah, these were late night films that were never really shown at any other time of the day. It was totally different than today. Today, if you have Roku, if you have Netflix, if you have Shudder, you can watch a horror movie at any time of the day or night. Back then, horror films were not really aired all that often. Sometimes they were on Saturday afternoons. Other than that, though, generally, late Saturday night, late Friday night, that was the only time you could watch these horror movies. So that was the incentive to stay up as late as you could to see as much of the movie as you could.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm sure that was how you became so much of a fan too, was because you liked baseball, and then right after that, I know me as a sports fan, it's kind of hard to just go to sleep after you've watched your team, especially if it's like a good game. So then you just keep it rolling with the horror after. That's cool.
Yeah, there was no reason for me as a youngster to leave the house on Saturday night.
Exactly.
I could watch the Yankees or the Mets if they were on, and then I could turn over to Chiller Theater late night.
Yeah.
And that would take me through to the next morning. It was also a real incentive to get your homework done late Friday night or Saturday morning so that you had time to do all this important stuff Saturday afternoon and evening.
Yeah, there you go. So this book is kind of like an investigation into this different stuff, kind of like a history of all of this, or...
Well, initially we talk about the Shock Theater package, which was made available to stations, mostly independent stations throughout the country. So this was not on the major networks like ABC, NBC, or CBS. This would be on the local independent stations that were looking for programming. So we talk about how Shock Theater began. We also explore some of the hosts, people like Zachary, Bob Wilkins in the Bay Area. But the main focus of the book is actually the movies themselves, because that's what I really loved first and foremost, was watching these films. So we have synopsis of probably about 150 of the films that were popular during this era. And basically the films run from 1931, when Dracula and Frankenstein first came out, all the way up until 1974. So it's a span, actually 1975 is the final year. So it's a span of 44 years where we cover the films in terms of their theatrical release. But in terms of being shown on television, this was starting in 1957 with Shock Theater, and then through the early 1970s, which is really when hosted horror on television started to fall by the wayside. It became a little bit less popular as we moved into the late 70s and the early 1980s. But it's interesting now that it's becoming popular again because of the success of Svengoolie, the success of Joe Bob Briggs.
Yeah.
And you think about somebody like Elvira, who has been around now since the early 1980s. That's 40 years. She's because of national hosts like that, horror hosts were more of a local phenomenon in the 50s, 60s, early 70s. But because of Elvira, Briggs, Svengoolie, they've become a national phenomenon. And this whole concept of horror hosting has become big again. People are really into it.
Yeah, that's really cool. It gives you a little break from the movie, get some commentary and some, get some laughs in, and then go back to the movie. So I could see the appeal there.
Yeah, I in particular love Joe Bob Briggs. I've had a chance to meet him. I've interviewed him at horror conventions. A very nice guy. He's very different in person than he is on the air. He's a lot quieter. He's more reserved. So you have to draw him out a little bit. But he's a really interesting guy. He has an encyclopedic knowledge of horror films. And he's one of the people that actually dedicated the book to, because as a horror host, going back to his days with the Movie Channel, when he was on TNT, all the way to what he's done very successfully now with Shudder. He has been exploring these movies for a very long time. He has a tremendous wealth of knowledge. And he's one of the reasons I think that I've sustained my interest in horror. I didn't know about him when I first started as a horror fan, but he's kind of kept me going. And he's shown that, it's not just for kids. Adults like us, we have a reason to be very interested in this too.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's cool. So you're a big baseball fan, big horror fan. Have these two ever kind of meshed together?
Well, not really in film, but the way that they've come close together is through comic books. And back in the 1950s, there were a number of comic books that became really popular. They were horror comics. Tales from the Crypt was the best known of them. There was also something called The Haunt of Fear. And back in the early 50s, The Haunt of Fear published a comic. It was a one-time comic, and it was called Foul Play. And it was about a midnight baseball game that took place in this mythical central city. And it was essentially revenge. There were two teams that were arch rivals. One of the teams had one of their players murdered by a player on the other team.
Okay.
So the team that was victimized, they decided that they were going to exact revenge on this player for the other team. They told him that they were going to honor him in a midnight ceremony. And in reality, what occurred was the player who had done the murdering to begin with, he himself was murdered out of revenge by the other team. And then the other team played a midnight baseball game, and I'm not making this up, using his body parts.
Wow, that's crazy.
They used his heart, they used his head, they used his legs. I mean, it was gruesome stuff. And this was all portrayed in this comic. And it was illustrated by Jack Davis, one of the most famous horror comic artists of all time. It was written, I think, by Al Feldstein, who was a very famous comic writer. So these were two very accomplished guys. And this appeared on paper, and it obviously created a huge stir. And it was one of the comics that led to this adoption of what's called the comic code, the comics code in the 1950s. And it essentially banned comic books from dealing with horror themes like vampires, werewolves, witches, murder. So as a result of this, there were actually congressional hearings that took place. There was a book written about the subject as well. But the people on the censorship side of the argument, they won out. They developed this comic code, and as a result of its adoption, Tales from the Crypt, Haunt of Fear, and the other horror comics of the time essentially were forced to go out of business. They were all run by a man named E.C. Gaines, and he realized he could not continue to publish horror comics under this strict code, so they all went by the wayside. And really for the next almost 20 years, we saw the complete elimination of horror comics, mainstream horror comics, dealing with horror themes. Now, by the late 1960s, a lot of this was starting to be ignored. And then eventually the comic code was pretty much bypassed by the 1970s. And that's when we started to see the return of new comic books featuring horror themes. But for the balance of the 1950s and for much of the 1960s, there were no mainstream comic books that dealt with horror. The only ones that dealt with horror were kind of underground comics that were a little bit harder to find, a little harder to purchase. In terms of a mainstream media, they were pretty much gone till the 1970s. Wow. So this had a radical effect on what went on in terms of the horror comic book industry was essentially eliminated for the better part of 2 decades. It has since come back. A lot of the themes that are explored or have been explored in comic books since then make what Tales from the Crypt and Haunt of Fear seem pretty mild, by comparison. But I'll tell you what, the foul play, the game featuring the body parts of the murdered baseball player, that's pretty extreme. I don't know if we've ever topped that since then. That's how it's extreme for today, and you can imagine how extreme it was for the 1950s.
Yeah, I need to look this up. Is this something that we can read now or check out? Or
you should be able to find it on the internet. I believe you can download it.
Okay.
I did a few years ago, and I think I saved it on my computer. So it should be there in a digital format. It is a collectible issue. I imagine it's worth quite a bit given the infamous theme.
Yeah.
But it's called Foul Play. That's the name of the comic. It was done by Al Feldstein, Jack Davis, and this was Haunt of Fear issue number 19.
Okay.
And I want to say it was early 1950s when it came out.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, that's
definitely take a look at it.
Yeah, I do want to. I will after we get off this call. All right, cool. Well, that is quite the mesh then. So that's a pretty important one for like the history of horror. Do you know, was the comic code like revised, or because you said that obviously horror comics exist now. Was it revised, or is it just kind of...
They call them graphic novels now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what happened is that it was pretty much starting to be ignored.
Okay.
And it just kind of fell out of date. It was just no longer enforced. And when you don't enforce it, it becomes pretty much useless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'm not sure. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember completely whether it was, completely scrubbed from the books, or if it just simply fell out of common usage, that it just was not a practical thing anymore. We've seen similar things done with films. In the mid 1930s, in reaction to movies like Dracula and Frankenstein, there was a code put in by Hollywood that severely limited what filmmakers could do. That's why some of the horror films from the late 1930s are actually milder than the horror films from the early 1930s. And as I recall with that code, that also started to lose steam by about the late 1960s.
Okay.
And by then it pretty much was being ignored. And that's what set the stage for, well, we're going to talk about this movie today.
Yeah.
But it's what set the stage for the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974.
Right.
Movies like that and more hardcore horror films started to become more popular in the 1970s. And the graphic nature of the themes, the brutality, sometimes suggested, often just overtly shown, really became intensified during that time. And it was because the motion picture code was essentially out of date by then.
Right. Okay. Awesome. Well, that's a good segue into the film we're going to review. So thanks for all that information and that little history lesson. I'm sure.
That was awesome.
Yeah, I'm sure. I know I learned something, so I'm sure our listeners have as well. Okay, so today we're going to discuss the third in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series, the third film, Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. So, Joel, can you tell us who was a part of this one?
All right, so this one starred Viggo Mortensen. He played Tex. He was in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Crimson Tide, and the remake of Psycho.
Oh yeah, he was.
Yeah,
that's right.
Also, Ken Foree, he's Benny, and he was in the Rob Zombie Halloween, Devil's Rejects, and Dawn of the Dead, the original, and also the remake as well. He had a little part in that one too. And also Kate Hodge is Michelle, I think, our main character.
Yeah.
I think. And she was in 20 episodes of She-Wolf of London, The Hidden 2, and a TV movie called Love Kills.
Okay.
And this was written by David J. Schow, Schow. I think I spelled that right. He did the screenplay for Critters 3 and 4. The Crow, also screenplay. And he did the story of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre at the beginning. Came up with the story for that one. And this was directed by Jeff Burr. He directed Puppet Master 3 and 4, Pumpkinhead 2, Blood Wings, and Stepfather 2, Make Room for Daddy.
Gotta love the subtitles.
I know.
Make room for Daddy. All right.
So
cool. Okay, so description of this film is a California couple and a survivalist encounter Leatherface and his family.
All right. I'm glad you had to look that.
Yeah.
Look that up.
IMDb has some of the greatest plot synopsis that you can find. I mean, that is pretty much what the movie is about.
It just sounds kind of weird, but
yeah. I mean, the Texas Chainsaw films are never really too complex.
Yeah.
But so, Bruce, are you a fan of this series? I assume you are as a horror fan, but how are your thoughts overall of the Texas Chainsaw series?
In terms of the series, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I would agree with a lot of fans in that the original is still the best. Even though it was made on such a small budget, it has a very gritty, almost documentary feel to it, but that only kind of enhances the feelings of horror, the feelings of terror. When you see Leatherface running around for the first time, when you see the house with all the bones on display. I mean, It's pretty shocking stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, for me, the original is very good, but there have also been some good moments in the sequels. In the second Texas Chainsaw Massacre film, which came out in 1986, Bill Moseley is very memorable as the Chop Top character.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, in later films, we see, I'm forgetting the name of the actor, but he was particularly good at playing military figures.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And he plays, he's supposedly a sheriff, but he's actually one of the family members disguised as a sheriff. He's kind of the patriarch to the family. He did the very famous war movie about the Vietnam War in the late 1980s.
Full Metal
an actor's
Jacket.
passed away, but he's very memorable in that particular Texas Chainsaw film. I've seen the ones with Jessica Biel, which are a little more slickly made. They're a little, the film techniques are a little better today than they were in 1974.
Mm-hmm.
And there's really a lot more gore in the more recent films than there was in the original. A lot of the gore in the original is really suggested. It's not actually seen on screen. But yeah, I would say I'm definitely a fan of the franchise. Can it be overdone? Has it been overdone? Sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there have been some memorable moments along the way. And I definitely keep up on the series, which has been going on now. I mean, 1974, my goodness, we're almost 50 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, that's crazy to think about. Okay, yeah, so his name, R. Lee Ermey.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, he was
great actor.
Great in that remake.
Yeah.
I love that. That's one of my favorites of the series.
Yeah, he was best. He played military figures probably better than anything.
Yeah.
But he could also play villains of various kinds. And I forget which of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies he did, but he's really good. I think he's the standout actor in that film.
Mm-hmm.
And, his performance is very much over the top, but he makes it work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's scarier than Leatherface in those.
Yeah.
Honestly, a lot of the family is scarier than Leatherface in these movies, though.
Yeah, the
in
families.
Some of these movies, they're just psychotic and
yeah,
addictive.
Okay, so So Texas Chainsaw 3. So for me, this one, I feel like there's not a lot of people that talk about this one.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like this one kind of just came and went. I mean, obviously I wasn't alive when this was, or actually I was alive when this released.
Yeah, it's in 1990.
Yeah, 1990. Okay, I was alive, but I hadn't watched it until recently.
Yeah.
And I just feel like it's never talked about. Bruce, do you remember when this came out, or did you happen to see it in theaters? Do you know if it was in theaters?
I did not see it in theaters. I know that it didn't do real well at the box office, and it didn't get very strong reviews. I want to say I first saw it in the early 90s on cable.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I don't know if it was HBO or something else. But I hadn't seen it for so long, so I did rewatch it last weekend just to kind of refresh my memory of it.
Okay.
I think one of the reasons why it's kind of overlooked, well, there's a couple problems with it. Number one, Gunnar Hansen is not in it. He is not Leatherface.
Yeah,
and even though it's not a verbal role, when he's not there, the mannerisms, the physicality, it's not the same.
Right.
I know that they wanted him to be in this movie and they offered him the role, but they couldn't come to agreement on salary. He felt he deserved more money. So they ended up going with a lesser known actor, Arhe Mihailoff, and physically he's actually bigger than Gunnar Hansen was. Gunnar Hansen was 6'4". Mihailoff is like 6'6".
Oh, wow.
But his physicality, his mannerisms they're just not as effective as Gunnar Hansen. So I think that's one of the problems.
Okay.
And I guess the other problem is there's maybe not a lot of big names other than Viggo Mortensen, who was really young at the time. He was unknown at the time. This was one of his first movies. So there's not necessarily a lot of star power, though I do like Ken Foree, the African-American actor who plays Benny. He's like the hero or one of the heroes of the movie.
Yeah.
He's probably the best performer in the film.
Yeah.
He's not really, though, an A-list actor. So maybe the lack of an A-list horror person, the lack of Gunnar Hansen has hurt this film's attention and notoriety over the years.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like a lot of people, talk about the first one. And even the second one has like a cult following just because of how zany it is and just really off the wall.
Crazy.
And then same with Next Generation. It has a following, and it gets talked about as this crazy Texas Chainsaw movie. But everybody just kind of skips over this one. And after watching it, I kind of get it. It's not anything too special, I wouldn't say. It's not a groundbreaking change of tone for the franchise, or it doesn't really do too much to move any sort of a story forward or anything like that. But there are some things that I liked. So, like you said, Benny. I think Benny is probably the best character in the film. Best acted as well. I think he's one of the better actors from the movie. And I just like his character overall. I like the soundtrack.
The music was pretty good.
Yeah, I thought it was cool to see Leatherface like driving and cranking up some heavy metal. That was cool. Thought that was interesting.
Or thought it'd be country or something, but
yeah. Southern rock or something. So I thought that was cool. The gas station attendant dude. He was kind of annoying at first, but and so we had subtitles on because he was kind of hard to understand.
Yeah. It didn't really matter. Like, he was talking gibberish anyway. But
when you read what he's saying, it's like, oh wow, okay, he's saying some off the wall stuff, and so got a little laugh out of me. And these movies always have a character like that. The gas station attendant in the middle of nowhere, of course, is going to be some creep and gonna turn them in the wrong direction, and it's always kind of a trope in these films.
Yeah, pretty much.
And then my favorite line from the movie. Why are you doing this? I think Benny says this. And then Tex says, "We're hungry."
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And then Benny says, "Haven't you heard of pizza?" And then Tex says, "I like liver
Yeah.
and onions
And pain.
and pain." Yeah.
Yeah.
So this movie, it came out in the '90s. So sometimes it's hard to tell. Are these movies trying to like take themselves seriously, or are they just trying to have fun? This one I think is a little bit of both. I think it's trying to have fun with lines like that. It's kind of hard to take it seriously, but then at the same time, I think it does have some serious moments and wants to still be a scary movie. So
I think my favorite part of this movie is we get a little insight into Leatherface, a little psychology of him. Obviously this guy, growing up never really probably didn't go to school. So, he definitely has the mind of a child.
Yeah.
Which you definitely get an insight in this movie, which I really liked. When his mama
yeah,
tells him to do his lessons and he goes and it's an electronic, like very early 90s electronic device that he's got. I like that aspect of it because it's not something that we've seen, I don't think.
I mean, we've
previously
seen him with, his definitely young mind in the first and second one, but we haven't seen him like go and do a lesson and but then he types in food for
it was like a person, I think is what the picture
like a clown,
was.
I think it was like a clown or something.
And he types in food and nope, wrong, try again. He just gets frustrated. Like he just keeps typing in food.
Yeah.
It's like to him that's what it is.
Yeah. That's what he eats.
So I think that was a really good part of the movie itself.
Yeah.
It wasn't very long. It was just like a short little, okay, this is how his mind works kind of thing, and we can move on from there.
Yeah.
After that, but
cool. Oh, and I also like his chainsaw. His new shiny,
shiny chainsaw.
he gets a custom chainsaw for his. I think they said it was his birthday or something. Or his, I don't know.
He just drops in the swamps.
Yeah, it's all rusty now.
Yeah.
So what'd you think, Bruce? What'd you think of this one?
When I saw the movie, I thought it's pretty mild in this series, except for the opening or one of the opening sequences when they discover the bodies that have been buried.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
and they explain how they've deteriorated and liquefied. To me, that was the most. I don't know if it was the scariest part of the film. It was the most disturbing part of the film when they talked about what happens to bodies when they're not disposed of properly. And when I saw that, I thought, yeah, this is really going to be a graphic movie. But then after that, it really doesn't follow up. And then in looking at the Wikipedia page for this film and also the IMDb page, apparently the director, Jeff Burr, his intention was to make this a very graphic, very violent film.
Okay.
And when it was first submitted, the censors said, we're going to have to rate this X because of how graphic it is.
Oh.
And the producers did not want that. They wanted an R rating. They wanted a film that more people could see.
Sure.
So they ended up having to make repeated cuts. I think they had to submit it 12 times.
Oh my gosh.
They ended up cutting about 4 minutes of some of the most graphic material. And it ends up being a very different film than what Jeff Burr, the director, had originally envisioned. I think he wanted to make, the second movie had been more comic than the first movie. He wanted to bring this back to a very violent, very serious movie without necessarily a lot of comedy other than the gas station attendant, which you guys talked about earlier. And I think that's what Burr's intention was, but the censors would not go along with it. And when they said, we're going to have to rate this X, that's when the producers stepped in and said, okay, we're going to cut the film.
Man.
And I think it hurts. I think it hurts the movie. It hurts the intention. It hurts some of the continuity. It's also interesting to note, Jeff Burr, the director, was actually fired early on.
Right.
And they tried to find somebody else to direct the movie. I think they may have asked Kane Hodder at one point, but they couldn't find anybody else who wanted to direct it. So they ended up offering it back to Jeff Burr. I mean, how often does that happen?
Yeah.
The director is fired and then brought back later in the production.
We can't find anyone else, so you're good.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's not a good sign right there.
No,
so there were some problems, but I think Burr's film, his intent was very different than what we ended up seeing.
Yeah. Yeah, I read that about him being fired and then eventually rehired after they couldn't find anybody else.
Let's see the director's cut.
Yeah, let's see that first submission.
What do you guys think about that opening scene where they talked about the liquefaction of the bodies and they? I thought that was pretty graphic, pretty powerful stuff.
It was. It definitely was.
And so I was. Yeah, we were watching it, and I was like, why are they wearing like hazmat suits? And is that why? Because of the liquefaction? Is it like,
are you saying that
toxic or something?
That they were poisoned?
Yeah.
Like you get enough of those bodies together, like decomposing at the same time, it's gonna. I can see it creating some sort of a toxic poison type of thing.
That's interesting.
So,
that's definitely a first for me. I don't think I've seen that and like that being described in other films.
Yeah.
You know, this collection of decomposing bodies and yeah, I mean, it definitely had a good setup. It kind of
it set the tone for the movie, which unfortunately didn't really deliver the rest of the like that particular tone that they were setting up there didn't really deliver throughout the entire movie.
Yeah. That's that continuity that Bruce was talking about.
Yeah.
Kind of started in this dark direction and then kind of went more into, just kind of quirky and cheesy.
Even when Leatherface would kill people, like the camera would turn away from it. Yeah. So you'd hear screaming, but you wouldn't see anything. It's like, all right, well, this is a Chainsaw Massacre movie, right?
Yeah. Definitely that was something I noticed. With a lot of off-screen, I guess you could say, kills. Which makes sense now, looking at some of the history with the censorship in this movie. So, what are some things that you liked about it, Bruce? Besides that opening scene.
Well, I really liked Ken Foray's performance. He's a really good actor. He's not, really a leading man or necessarily a star in a lot of films, but he did the original Dawn of the Dead.
Yeah.
He did The Devil's Rejects. I mean, he's done a number of movies. He's had a really long career.
Yeah.
He's apparently off-screen a very likable guy, and his character in this film is actually a guy that you root for. He's very heroic.
Yeah.
So I thought he was a tremendous strength. I thought Mortensen was pretty good with a character that wasn't necessarily on screen all that much. It was interesting to see him very young also.
Yeah.
I can't remember seeing him in any films before this. So he does look quite a bit different. So I thought that was a strength. In terms of the quality of the film, I certainly don't think it was a terrible film, nor do I think it was a particularly good film.
Yeah.
I think it was mediocre. I would give it 2.5 stars out of 5.
Okay.
I thought it, the potential was there for something a little more special, but it did not fully deliver that. So I think it's a decent movie. It's probably not the worst in the franchise, but it's certainly not the best either.
No.
Yeah. It's kind of nothing special when it comes to the rest of these films and just horror films in general. So I could definitely see why it's kind of not discussed or talked about too much. Although it does have an interesting history that Bruce just mentioned with the director and some of the cuts that they had to do and all that. So, okay, cool. Did you have anything else you wanted to add to what you liked or didn't like?
I mean, yeah, we pretty much talked about it. Besides, I do like the psychology behind Leatherface in that 1 or 2 scenes that we got from that. And the acting was actually decent for like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie.
Yeah,
like I've definitely seen worse in this franchise for sure. I still, I don't think I'm ever gonna forgive Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original, for Franklin. He is the worst character, probably in horror. The most annoying character.
You're not a fan, huh?
I'm not a fan. So we didn't have a Franklin in this one, so that's always a plus in my book. And yeah, the opening scene was really cool. It set the tone for the rest of the movie. And yeah, I wish we got some to like see some actual kills and stuff.
Yeah.
Because I know for horror, like blood is one of the easiest things to. I mean, the most B-rated movies sometimes have like the most gore and stuff like that, but we didn't hardly get any of that in this one, which I get to a certain extent. But when you're on the censorship committee, you have to understand that you're making a Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. Yeah. So maybe be okay with a little bit more.
Yeah, it sounds
more gore
like
in your movies.
It sounds like things were a lot more taboo back then, so that they couldn't do as much.
You mentioned the character of Franklin and how annoying he was.
Yeah,
he's played by an actor named Paul Partine, who I think passed away a few years ago. I think the best actor, maybe in the first movie, is the guy who played the grandfather, John Dugan.
Okay.
He plays that decrepit, aging grandfather who looks like he's about 118 years old.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And the makeup is incredible. His performance during that dinner scene is amazing. I actually got a chance to interview him a few years ago at Scaricon here in upstate New York. He's a very interesting guy. He initially got a little upset with me when I talked about how controversial the first movie was because of the, extreme nature, the extreme theme. And he really kind of protested against that and said, if you look back at that movie, there's almost no blood shown.
Yeah.
Most of the gore is suggested. It's not displayed. And he actually is right about that. We think of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre as this, horrific, brutal movie that's hard to stomach. And then you look back at it and you compare it to what is seen today. It's no comparison at all, but it still holds up as a classic because the suggestion of horror is so powerful. And I thought Dugan's performance as that decrepit old grandfather in that first movie, I really thought he was the standout character for me in the first movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we get to see Grandpa in this one too.
Yeah.
Yeah, different actor, not as effective, but the same principle. Yeah,
he gets his head sunken in at one point. The end there.
That's right.
Talking about the original, even for today's standards, yes, there isn't gore and a ton of blood and all that, but it's just disturbing. It's really disturbing, and that's where I think the controversy comes from, is just the realism. That dinner scene is just so psychologically just brutal. It's brutal on the mind.
Yeah.
And I think that's more so where the controversy comes from, not necessarily the what is shown as far as blood and guts. Because when I first watched the original, I didn't like it. I thought, man, this is too much. This is kind of annoying, especially the end scene with the dinner and all the screaming. And
they were mocking her. So
yeah, but after watching it a number of times, I kind of grew to appreciate what they were trying to do there. And I kind of get it now. First time I was like, what the hell is this? This is not entertaining at all. I don't see why this is seen as a classic, but after a few viewings, I get it. So yeah, okay. So you said 2.5 out of 5 stars. So typically when we end an episode, we give it a rating. We kind of do like the Rotten Tomatoes rating, where we give it a percentage out of 100. So are you saying you'd give it like a 50, just kind of right in the middle?
Yeah, maybe 45%, something like that. Little below the median.
Yeah.
It definitely had a few moments of interest. Could have been really, really good. Would love to see what the original version was before all the cuts and the edits.
Yeah.
Might have made quite a bit of a difference, but it's a decent film. I think if you're a fan of the franchise, you probably have to see it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Cool. What about you, Joel?
I'm gonna give this one a 67. I'd say.
67.
Yeah.
Dang. All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. I mean, this one is kind of like under the radar type of thing. Not like nobody's, like you're saying, nobody really talks about it. And there are definitely parts of it that I do enjoy. Especially compared to other movies in this franchise. And yeah, it's just, I enjoyed most of the acting for people. I enjoyed, the story they were going with here. And as simple as it may be,
Yeah.
there still is something there. And yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't just randomly put it on.
Right.
At any time. If I'm doing like a marathon or something, then yeah, I'll watch it. But yeah, it's a decent movie. It's,
okay.
In this franchise, it's middle of the road, I would say.
All right. Well, I'm gonna go 52.
Okay.
Thought it was okay. Nothing too special. Had potential, and I think was it 1990?
1990.
Yeah.
Okay. So, we kind of get into, back in the 70s, the acting was pretty good in the 70s, but once you get into the 80s, acting in like these slashers kind of fall off.
Mm-hmm.
And when you get into the 90s, the acting gets a little better.
Yeah.
And so I think, that's where we kind of were at this time. So the acting wasn't too bad. It wasn't too like cringy. So
yeah,
I'll give it that. But other than that, yeah, it's some laughs too. I definitely was entertained with some of the comedy in there. Whether it was purposeful or not, I don't know. But it made me laugh a number of times. So entertainment value was there. So yeah, I'll go 52.
I wonder how people who actually live in like back roads states think about this franchise.
Yeah.
Like,
well, they don't know.
Us a bad name.
They don't know. They don't have TVs or internet. So, but yeah, no, I would imagine people from Texas and these small towns are probably like,
not a fan.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to be represented that way.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, Bruce, thanks for coming on. Thanks for talking to us about, the history of this comic book and some of the history of the horror hosts and all that good stuff, and giving us some insight into Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw 3.
Yes.
Well, thank you, guys. I appreciate you having me on. I had a lot of fun, and call me back again. I'd love to be on to talk about some other topics, too.
Definitely, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, we will reach out.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so this has been our episode on Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, and this has been Scare Talk.
Sleep tight.
Don't let Tex